Do you want your RTX 50 series GPU to run faster? Or cooler and more efficient? You might want to try overclocking or undervolting. Check out this video. This overclocking and undervolting guide is supported by MSI, who sent over a GeForce RTX 5060 Ti 16GB and the GeForce RTX 5070 Ti 16GB gaming trio. The tuning guide is based on GeForce RTX 50 series Blackwell GPU using the universal tuning tool MSI Afterburner. You can also check out our intro to MSI Afterburner features at the link below. Let's get started. Hi there. Today, we'll be doing a quick revisit of GPU tuning, both overclocking and undervolting in 2025. We'll focus more on overclocking and undervolting specifically from the perspective of GeForce RTX 50 series Blackwell. Of course, in theory, GPU undervolting and overclocking can be done on any GPU, so you don't need a special GPU. A card with an OC label doesn't mean whether the GPU can be overclocked or not. Also, overclocking is not limited to NVIDIA GPUs. You can overclock AMD Radeons or Intel Arcs. Even mobile laptop GPUs can be overclocked or undervolted, at least in theory. But you will need a tool or software to access the GPU settings, especially the clock speed or frequency and the voltage. In this video, I will be using two RTX 50 series GPUs as testbeds. The MSI RTX 5060 Ti 16GB gaming trio is used to represent the mainstream or mid-range segment, and the RTX 5070 Ti 16GB is our example for the high-end class. Also, I expect that the concept in this guide can also be applied across other RTX 50 series GPUs. For example, like the lower mid-range models like the RTX 5060 or the RTX 5050, or even the higher series like 5080 or 5090. Generally speaking, GPUs with the same architecture and the same fabrication process, their voltage and frequency tend to be roughly similar. But please note, this does not mean 100% identical. Even the exact same GPU model can have silicon variations, what we often call as the silicon lottery. You might get lucky or you might not. Because of this factor, your results may vary. Consider everything in this video only as a guideline, a starting point, not something that you must copy exactly one-to-one. After all, this is just a starting point. Okay, this is the full specs of the PC I'm using. You can pause it if you want to take a closer look. For the overclocking software, we'll be using MSI Afterburner. Even though it has MSI branding, Afterburner is universal, so it will work with other GPU brands too. Alright, I'll switch over to this system so I can capture the GPU tuning step for you. Let's get to it. This is MSI Afterburner's interface. If we go into the properties, you'll find various skins you can choose for Afterburner, like this for example. But I'm using the default skin for this guide. So if you're watching from the future and the default skin looks different, please adjust accordingly. Next, we go to the general options and we'll unlock voltage control and unlock voltage monitoring for our tuning. We apply and the Afterburner will restart. After that, when we installed MSI Kombustor, there's a K button you can press to launch the MSI Kombustor app like this. As an optional step, we can go back into Options, then into the Monitoring tab to enable on-screen display items like GPU temperature, GPU usage, VRAM usage, GPU core clock, GPU memory clock, power, GPU voltage, CPU usage, RAM usage, and then frame rate. When we click Apply, another app turns on called Riva Tuner Statistics Server, or RTSS. Here, there's a Show On-Screen Display button we can enable. If the on-screen display is enabled, then in 3D apps like MSI Kombustor stress test, you'll see several variables you can monitor. Of course, this is completely optional because you could also use the NVIDIA overlay inside the NVIDIA app. Next, we'll move on to the tuning experiment. This time, I will start with opening MSI Kombustor. You don't have to use MSI Kombustor. You can use Games or 3D Mark. I'm using MSI Kombustor to make it easy. The first thing we will do is power limit tuning. Right now, the GPU is running at 2.76 GHz at around 1.04 volts. And we can also see on the NVIDIA overlay, the GPU is pulling 166 watts. Now, when we move the power limit slider, say we max it out to 122 and click apply, we'll see the GPU clock rise a bit, though not too much. The voltage also goes up. And if your GPU supports voltage control, we can change core voltage with this slider. We can max it out to 100 on this slider, and then we can click apply. You will see the voltage go up and the frequency rise a little. Here we might want to overclock a bit more aggressively with manual control. When overclocking, it is crucial to monitor our GPU temperatures. Our GPU is around 66 degrees Celsius, which is quite safe to overclock. Just in case, I'll turn off auto for the fans and run them a little bit faster. Here, about 50% fan speed is more than enough for overclocking in this card. Now let's move on to the core clock adjustment. For now, I want you to focus only on the core clock. Do not touch the memory clock yet. It is recommended to try setting just one variable at a time. We can increase it in 50 MHz steps. Let's add 50 MHz. You'll see the core clock go up. Next, plus 100. Now it's around 2.9 GHz. Then, plus 200. The GPU is now at 3 GHz. We'll keep going until it crashes. At 250, it still runs. Plus 300. Seems fine. Plus 350. Still okay. Then we try plus 400. And it crashed. When the system crashes and freezes, the GPU driver will attempt automatic recovery. Sometimes we don't even need to reboot the system. GPU auto recovers and returns to default. We can hit reset to clear settings before trying again. The system has now recovered, and now we're running the GPU at plus 300 MHz. It failed around plus 400, and at plus 300 it seems stable enough, with the GPU at about 3.1 GHz and around 1.07 volts. So after finding the error point at plus 400, we back off by about minus 100, or if you want to be more conservative, like minus 150. This is an estimated config you might use for daily. What about memory overclocking? We can use the memory slider here. Thankfully, with GDDR7 on the RTX 50 series, memory overclocks can be fairly aggressive. We can even set like plus 2000 here. which sets it at an effective 32 GB per second. Or if you want to max the slider, you can go to plus 3000. Most GDDR7 so far seems to handle plus 3000 easy. As the next step, continue with various stress tests. You can try other apps or maybe test other MSI Kombustor's presets, like picking a different one here. You'll also notice in this other stress test, the second stress test, the core clock goes up. It was around 3.1 GHz before, now it's about 3.14 GHz. Sometimes when the GPU is right on the edge between stable and unstable, differences in workload between apps or games can cause instability, even if your settings were stable in a couple other game or app. That's why it's highly recommended to do stability tests across all the apps or games you actually use. You can use MSI Kombustor as stability estimate. It is fine as a starting point, but it is very important to test stability in every app or game you intend to use daily. Once you've done your stability test and the GPU is stable in your apps and temperature are reasonable, you can save the profile. Click Save and then set it to profile, for example, profile 1 here. Now we will do fine-tuning with the curve editor found here. Click it to bring up the voltage frequency curve editor. We can call it the VF curve. In the VF curve editor, you can specify exactly which voltage the GPU should use and what frequency it should run. For instance, now our GPU is running at 3150 MHz at 1.08 volts. I want to change that to 1.05 volts at about 3.1 GHz. Click that VF point. Next, we have the options to lock the GPU, forcing it to operate only at the maximum point that we set. For example, 3.1 GHz at 1.05 volt. We can lock that VF point. Press L twice on the keyboard. Press L once and then twice, you will see horizontal yellow line appear. And then we can click Apply. Now, after applying, you can see the GPU drops to 3.1 GHz as we set, and the voltage is under the 1.05 volts we set earlier. There's another method to lock the VF curve. For example, click the 1.05 volts 3.12 GHz point. Hold Shift on the keyboard, then click and drag over all the VF point to the right. While still holding Shift, press Enter twice to flatten the VF curve. With the maximum point at 1.05 volts and the clock at 3.12 GHz, click Apply. You'll get a result similar to pressing L twice earlier. Once you get a result like this, you can also save it, saving the VF curve to a specific profile, like this. So we have two ways to lock the VF curve: click and drag, or the simpler way, pressing L twice on the keyboard on a specific VF point, like so. I'll use the second method using L on the keyboard because it is faster. Now we'll try undervolting. Undervolting is done to lower operating temperatures and reduce power, improving power efficiency or FPS per watt. Besides manual undervolting, which we'll cover shortly, the easiest way to get power savings from undervolting is simply to lower the power limit slider to the left, like this. Note that each GPU has a different minimum power limit. On this GPU, the minimum power limit slider is 83%. Let's observe. The GPU is at 2.76 GHz, 1.05 volts, temperature around 64 degrees, and power around 167 watts, almost 170 watts. Now we click apply for the power limit. You can see the GPU now operates at 2.65 GHz, voltage drops towards 1 volt, temperature drops a bit, and power, which was originally at 170 watts, is now around 150 watts. This is a very simple way to undervolt a GPU just by lowering the power limit. Next, we'll use the curve editor to do manual undervolting. We can see the VF point. GPU currently targets close to 2.8 GHz at 1.05 volts. With the VF curve editor, we can command the GPU to pick a different VF point. For example, I'll choose 950 mV at 2.5 GHz, then press L twice to lock it. Click apply. Now you can see the GPU drops its clock speed to 2.5 GHz and the voltage drops to 950 mV and the power drops to 130 watts. This is already lower power than what we got from the power limit method. Now we can try other voltage frequency points that might be more ideal for power saving on this GPU. There are several undervolting strategies. A common one is to keep default GPU clock and select slightly lower operating voltage. First, click the 950 mV point. We will drag this point up. There are several ways to do it. The easiest is hold Shift and drag with the mouse up towards the 2.8 GHz point, like that. And then we will lock it with pressing L twice, targeting 2.8 GHz at 950 mV. Click apply. You will see the frequency does not change. It is still close to default, but the voltage drops from originally 1.05 volts down to 950 mV, and the power has dropped quite a bit from 170 watts to around 140 watts. Of course, we can continue tuning to find a lower voltage point where the GPU can operate at near default frequency with as little voltage as possible. Now let's try 900 mV. Alright, click and drag up to 2.8 GHz point, then lock with pressing L twice, like so, and apply. The frequency is still similar, 2.7 to almost 2.8 GHz. The voltage drops again from 950 mV down to 900 mV, or 0.9 volts. Power also drops to 122 watts. Let's continue to the next point, 850 mV. Click and drag it up towards 2.8 GHz. Press L twice to lock, and then we will click apply. And it fails. That means 0.85 volts or 850 mV is too low to be stable. We were stable at 900 mV or 0.9 volts. There is another undervolting strategy which seeks the maximum possible power savings, meaning we chase the lowest power consumption using very low voltage. Of course, this comes with some sacrifice in GPU frequency. It's usually done by choosing very low operating voltage, way lower than before. For example, like 850 mV, 800 mV, or even below that, approaching the minimum voltage around 0.7 volts. Note that the minimum allowed GPU voltage will vary depending on the GPU unit or model. Some GPUs only allow a minimum of 0.8 volts, Some others may be limited to around 0.85 volts, and there is some units that allow as low as 700 or 725 millivolts. We will go increase the clock again and see the maximum GPU clock speed that we can get at 0.8 volts. Let's try that out. .5 GHz at 0.8 volts still runs. We can push it higher. 700 offset is set and lock and try to apply. And now it crashed. That means we can still operate the GPU at 0.8 volts around maybe 2.4 GHz range. But of course, some users may try for even more power savings by lowering the voltage further. Here, we will try to find the minimum allowed GPU voltage at which the GPU is still allowed to operate. Remember, every GPU will be different. As you can see, we tried to make the GPU request only 700 mV at 2 GHz, but unfortunately that will not run. So our lowest point earlier was around 725 mV. We'll try to increase the core clock again at this range, try to lock it and apply. Nope, it does not work. Now we will re-evaluate all the overclocking and undervolting configs we tried on the MSI RTX 5060 Ti Gaming Trio. Let's look at Profile 1. Apply. The target is 3.1 GHz at 1.05 volts, so the result is about 3.07 GHz at 1.035 volts. Here, we also overclock the memory to an effective 32 GB per second. If your card can handle it, you can try a plus 3000 memory offset. Additionally, you can see the power is fairly high, beyond 180 watts. This is our highest performance profile, and of course, this is the most power hungry too. Now we'll reset and move on to the next configuration. Undervolting while keeping the frequency at default. So same frequency, but the voltage drops to 0.9 volts. In this profile, we still get the same performance as default with slight power saving. Power drop from 170 watts to around 120 watts. Okay, now let's go to the next profile where we do a slightly more extreme undervolt because we use a low voltage, 0.8 volts. Unfortunately, the stable GPU frequency is only around 2.4 GHz here. But we do get even bigger power savings. We're now under 100 watts on GPU. Now we'll move to the last profile, the undervolt profile applying 0.725 volts, the lowest voltage supported by this particular GPU. At this really low voltage, frequency drops a lot to 2.1 GHz, which obviously carries a performance penalty. The next step, you can choose to apply at Windows Startup with this button. This is personal preference, but I prefer to not apply at Windows Startup. Prefer loading profiles in Afterburner before starting applications or games. Again, this is personal preference. If you think your system is stable enough, you can choose to apply at Windows Startup. Alright, now let's try our second GPU, the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Gaming Trio. Our second system here with the RTX 5070 Ti looks ready. Now let's jump right into the overclocking practice. Let's go! Now, we'll evaluate all the tuning we did, both undervolting and overclocking on our second GPU, the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Gaming Trio. At default, this GPU runs at almost 2.8 GHz around 1.04 volts. It has far more shader units than the 5060 Ti earlier. You can see that even at default, it's already close to pulling 290 watts of power. That's pretty high. Now let's look at our overclocking settings at profile 1 here. Let's click apply. When we apply it, the GPU runs at 3.15 GHz at 1.035 volts, slightly higher than what we achieved in the RTX 5060 Ti. We also overclocked the memory to the same effective 32 GB per second. You can see the power draw now exceeds 300 watts. This makes sense because at the default, this GPU starts as 280 or 290 watts, and after we overclock and push the power limit on the voltage, it will consume more power. Okay, let's see our next profile. First we reset, and then we load profile 2. This is our undervolt profile. Here, we try to keep the clock speed the same as default, close to 2.8 GHz, but we use lower voltage 0.9 volts. You can see the temperature drop and the power drops as well, from default 290 watts to around 230 watts, almost 240 watts. Next, we have a more aggressive undervolt profile. We will use the lowest voltage that our 5070 Ti supports, so now we run at 0.8 volts. The achievable clock in this range is slightly lower than before, around 2.35 GHz. Slightly slower than what our 5060 Ti can achieve. Here, we can see the power consumptions of our 5070 Ti drops quite a lot, now into 170 watt range. So the 5070 Ti power consumption after undervolt becomes similar to a 5060 Ti at default. Okay, I think we already covered the process of overclocking, undervolting, and so on for both the 5060 Ti and the 5070 Ti. Now let's look at the results: performance, power, thermals, frame rate, and more. Plus, I will share a few tips for setting up RTX 50 series cards, especially the ones I use here. Let's go! Okay, looks like we're done here. So, quick summary using the black myth Wukong results. The RTX 5060 Ti overclock can go up about 10%. That's pretty decent. The undervolt at 0.8 volts and 2.4 GHz gets almost 90% of the volt performance with much lower power. If you look at the power during undervolt, that's the power level of an RTX 4060 laptop. So far so good. On to the 5070 Ti. The overclock does not gain as much as the 5060 Ti, so 5060 Ti looks better for overclock. But maybe it's because the 5070 Ti's default is already very high. The undervolt on the RTX 5070 Ti is much more interesting, because at power similar to a 5060 Ti default, its performance is far higher. We can say the 5070 Ti's power efficiency when undervolted is better than a stock 5060 Ti. Alright, I hope this guide is helpful and wasn't too long. If you still want more, there's a live stream version about this in my channel. That's about 5 hours if I'm not mistaken, covering the step-by-step from the very beginning on a similar system that we use here. If any of you have tried overclocking or undervolting your GPU, please flex your tuning results in the comment section below. Those information are useful to others as well, so everyone can try to match your configuration. Also, let me know if you want to see more overclocking and tuning. Just drop in the comment which hardware you're interested in. If I have the hardware, I will try to cover it. And that's pretty much it. Alright, see you in the next one. Bye-bye.